I can't see. I haven't got my glasses on, that's why. Hello. We're rejoining a conversation this week, a conversation about injustice. A conversation about injustice between a guy with an underused name, Habakkuk, who was an Old Testament prophet, and the sovereign creator God of the universe. They are chatting about injustice. And the question we should all be asking by this stage of the conversation is this one. How can you, the God of justice, use unjust people to bring about your justice? Why is that the question we should all be asking? Well, because in chapter 1, verses 1 to 11, the passage we looked at last week, if you were with us, God responded to Habakkuk's complaint about horrific injustice among his people by saying that he would be sending the even more horrific, the even more unjust Babylonians to sort things out. If you remember the Babylonians, the ancient equivalent of the Taliban. And this is a bit of a puzzle. You complain to God about injustice, you complain to God about horrific things happening amongst his people, and he says to you, I'm going to send even more unjust people, even more horrific people to sort it out. That leaves Habakkuk, that leaves us, doesn't it, with questions? Even God himself concedes in chapter 1 and verse 4 that what he says is amazing, unbelievable, at one level just does not make sense. And so Habakkuk is immediately writing another complaint form out. He's immediately got the paperwork and he is there and he is writing another complaint to God in his righteous fury, really. In it, he both, as it were, humbly accepts what God has said will happen to his unjust people, and at the same time, confidently questions the justice of it, confidently complains to the God of justice about the injustice he seems to be just about to carry out. See this for yourself by looking down at verses 12 and 13 of chapter 1. Habakkuk says, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgments. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. That is basically Habakkuk saying to God, yep, you can do this. You're allowed to do this. You're justified in sending judgment on your people. But then he starts his complaint. God, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? How can you send the even worse Babylonians to sort out injustice amongst God's people? Because they are even more unjust than God's people. God, you seem to be sort of compounding the problem, not solving it here. How can you, the God of justice, use unjust people to bring about your justice? That is Habakkuk's question down there in verse 13. That should be our question here today. How can you, God? How can you do this? You say you're just. How can you use such horrifically unjust people to bring about what you say is your justice? Habakkuk's filling in his complaint form, and he reminds God of how just he is. He reminds God of how unjust, the Babylonians are. He, as it were, sort of fills out his complaint. Verses 14 to 16. You have made people like fish in the sea, like sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? What Habakkuk's doing here is he's sort of portraying the Babylonians as industrial scale fishermen. You know, the sort of fishermen that buy themselves a massive industrial scale trawler and go out to sea and basically drag everything up in their nets, leaving nothing behind, killing off every bit of life in the sea. And then going home and living off the profits, living off the back of the destruction they have caused. That is what the Babylonians are like, according to Habakkuk. That is what God needs to hear about the Babylonians, just in case he's forgotten. Habakkuk cannot believe that his just God is going to use those sort of people to bring about justice. Which is why he says that he poses that question down in verse 15. Are the Babylonians to keep on emptying their net, destroy nations without mercy? Are you going to let them get away with it, God? Are you going to let them destroy everything and everyone and do nothing about it? What are you going to do about it, God? Well, as Habakkuk ends his complaint form, he knows that he's going to get an answer, because he knows that his God is just. And so he waits with patient confidence. Look down at verse 1 of chapter 2. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to what he, that's God, will say to me, and what answer I am to give to his complaint. I love the picture we get here of Habakkuk having made his complaint, going up to the walls of Jerusalem and standing there waiting for an answer. And I want you to just for imagine his sort of body language. I don't think it's this. I don't think it's a sort of, let's going to see if he actually comes up with an answer to my complaint. No, in fact, I think it's this. I think he's like a sort of a watchman. The soldier doing night watch duty, confidently looking out, knowing that at some point soon the dawn is going to come. At some point soon he is going to get an answer to his question. That is Habakkuk. He has complained to God. He's made a fuss in God's presence. Now he is waiting for a response. Patiently, quietly, confidently waiting for his God he knows to be just to answer him. And just as an aside, I wonder whether that's us when we pray to God. I wonder whether that's us when we complain to God. Do we sort of find ourselves, standing around like this, not really expecting an answer? Or do we find ourselves, as it were, on the ramparts, looking out, expectantly waiting for our God, our just God, to hear our complaint? Well, Habakkuk's waiting is not in vain. His complaining is not in vain. God gives an answer to his complaint. And it's an answer that God tells Habakkuk to share with other people. Chapter 2, verse 2. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets, so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end, and it will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. I love how God makes clear that his reply to Habakkuk's complaint isn't just for Habakkuk. It's for people of all around the world of his time. Habakkuk's to write it out and he's to send it off on tablets. That's not tablets made by Apple. It's tablets that he would have had to sort of carve his message on and send off all around the world of his day. And it's actually not just for the world of Habakkuk's day, because it speaks of the end. What we have here is, as it were, a timeless answer to a timeless complaint. Human beings throughout history have said to God, how can you, the God of justice, use unjust people to bring about your justice? People have asked God that question time and time and time again. And this, as it were, is God's timeless answer to anybody, anywhere, who anytime poses him that question. So what is his answer? What is his answer to Habakkuk's complaint, to a complaint that we ourselves might have made? Well, the first thing that God does is agree with Habakkuk's assessment of the Babylonians. Habakkuk, as it were, hasn't got them wrong. Habakkuk hasn't had a far too negative assessment of the Babylonians. No, Habakkuk, as it were, got them right. Look down at chapter 2 and verse 4. God is really clear. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never at rest. Because he is as greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied, he gathers to himself all the nations and takes captive all the peoples. God says, yeah, Habakkuk, you've got it right. These Babylonians are more horrific. They are more unjust than my people. They are a nasty piece of work. And having, as it were, said that, agreed with Habakkuk on that, God then makes it clear that his perfect justice is on its way. He might be temporarily going to use unjust people, the Babylonians, to bring about justice on his people, the Israelites, but it is only a temporary measure. One day he is going to bring perfect justice for everyone. One day soon he is going to bring perfect justice for all. In this passage, God calls out 5 different representative types of injustice that we see in the Babylonians and what they did, but also which we'll see in our world today and which history shows has been part of this world since, well, almost since time began. There are 5 woes that God speaks. 5 times when he condemns particular patterns of behavior in unjust people, highlights them, calls them out, and says, those who have done these things will be facing my justice one day soon. And as God goes through these 5 examples, he doesn't, as it were, just say, justice is coming. He also tells us what sort of justice is coming. He helps us know the principle of justice that the Babylonians and the others that do these things are going to face. And it's this basic principle of justice. What people have done to others will be done to them. That is what God's justice looks like. What people have done to others will be done to them. We're not going to get through each of the 5 examples. Let's just take 2 examples. 2 of these woes that God calls out in verses 6 to 19. And let's look first of all at the example in chapter 2 and verse 6. God says, "Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long must this go on? Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will not they wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey. Because you have plundered many nations, the people who have left will plunder you, for you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them." What's God's point? God's point is that those who, like the Babylonians, have stolen other people's goods and lives and lands will have their own goods and lives and lands taken away from them. What they have done to others will one day soon be done to them. Second example, look at verses 15 to 17. God says, "Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin until they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. You will be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it's your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming round to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The violence you've done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you. For you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them." God says that those who have, like the Babylonians, led others into addiction so that they can use them, led others into pattern of drinking so that they can take sexual advantage of them, will be used and humiliated themselves. what they have done to others will be done to them. And let's just think about it for a moment. That basic principle of justice, what you have done to others will be done to you, is the most basic principle of justice that people call out for all on this earth, don't they? Particularly when they've been on the receiving end of injustice. As one person recently put it, outside her sister's murder trial, in my eyes, justice is an eye for an eye. You brutally murder someone, then you pay the ultimate price, a life for a life. That is what we think true justice is. What you have done to others is done to you. God's response to Habakkuk's question, God's response to our question, how can you, the God of justice, use unjust people to bring about your justice, is this. Justice will be done one day soon. I am temporarily going to use the Babylonians to bring about justice. I will temporarily use other people throughout human history to bring about my justice. But one day soon, I will bring perfect justice on all injustice and on all unjust people. And the principle of justice will be, what you have done to others will be done to you. Everybody will get their just deserts. No injustice that has been carried out in the history of this planet will be left unpunished by our God, who will do perfect justice. In fact, it will be such perfect justice, such wonderful, such beautiful justice, that no one will have anything to complain about then. When God has done justice, nobody will be reaching for a complaint for. No one will be raising their hands to say, oh, I just wonder, God. No, instead, verse 20, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. Everyone will be there going, yeah, justice has been done. Beautifully, wonderfully, perfectly, and at last. So that's good news. I mean, that is good news, isn't it? I mean, just think about the amount of injustice happening on this planet today. We're aware of some of it. We know nothing of most of it. And yet one day, the God who created the world, one day the God who sees all the injustice happening will do something about it. And his justice will be perfect. His justice will be so perfect that nobody will ever complain. That is going to happen one day soon. Says God in answer to our question, when are you going to bring about justice? He is going to bring it one day soon. Well, let's get on to the ramparts then. Let's start looking out for that justice. Let's confidently ask it for it to happen one day really soon. Except that we do need to think about what this means for us. I mean, just think, if the principle of justice at the end of time, if the principle of justice that God is going to use to judge everything in this world, everyone in this world, including everything you've done, everybody in this room, if the principle of justice is this, what you have done to others will be done to you, which of us is looking forward to that day? I mean, we know it's bad news for the Babylonians. We're looking forward to them facing this sort of injustice. We know it's bad news for the North Korean leadership. We know it's bad news for the military junta in Burma. We know it's bad news for... But it's also, isn't it, bad news for us, that principle of justice? I mean, just let me share the implications of this for me personally. I, like most Westerners, enjoy a prosperity that is to a large extent feeding off the poverty of others. Perfect justice would demand that I soon feel what it's like to be not at the top of the pile, but at the bottom of the pile. I, like most of us, have thought about and acted towards other people in appalling ways. God's justice set out here would say that I deserve to be on the receiving end of similar thoughts, of similar actions myself. I, like all other human beings in the history of humanity bar one, have sought to dethrone the creator God of the universe and replace him with idols that I myself have made or other people have made. My just desserts would be my creator God rejecting me just as I've rejected him time and time and time again. That's what perfect justice looks like for Ed Shaw. And for you. What you have done to others will be done to you. What I have done to others will be done to me. What the Babylonians have done to others will be done to them. This begins to sound not exactly like good news. And so we begin to feel verse 20 of chapter 2 ourselves, don't we? The Lord is in his holy temple. He's up there. He's a God of justice. Let all the earth be silent before him. None of us have got anything to say in our favour to justify our behaviour. We're all in trouble and we know it. At which point our question stops being, how can you, the God of justice, use unjust people to bring about your justice? He's answered that. It's now a much more heartfelt question. It's this. How can you, the God of justice, justly save unjust people like me from your justice? If this is perfect justice and it's coming and I deserve it as much as anybody else, is there any way out? Is there any just way out for me to escape your justice? Is there any hope for any of us on this planet today? We'll have a look down at chapter 2 and verse 4. In the midst of all this talk about injustice, all this talk about God's just judgment of injustice, an alternative is briefly there. It's just sort of dangled there for us to notice. It's a little glimmer of light that's provided in this otherwise, let's be honest, quite bleak chapter. Look at those words at the second half of chapter 2 and verse 4. But the righteous person will live by his faithfulness or faith. This little phrase in chapter 2, verse 4 of Habakkuk is picked up 3 times in the New Testament as a pointer to the good news of Christianity, as a pointer to the gospel. Perhaps most famously of all, it's picked up by the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1 and verses 16 and 17. Let me read those for us. Paul writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." How can the God of justice justly save unjust people? How can the God of righteousness rightly save wrong people? How can God be just and preserve justice and do perfect justice and yet let some people, as it were, off the hook? Justice demands that we all face God's judgment on the basis of what we have done to others being done to us. That's what we're all facing. Is there any way of any of us being saved, any of us escaping the judgment that we deserve? Well, yes. That's what the rest of Romans tells us, isn't it? There is a way. There's a beautiful way. There's a way by the perfect Jesus taking our imperfect place, facing all we have done to others himself in his life on earth, but ultimately, most importantly, in his death on the cross. God in Christ famously swaps places with you and me. What we have done to others and should be done to us is instead not done to us, but they take it themselves. Jesus faces everything I have done to other people himself. He takes the justice I've deserved in my place to let me, as it were, off the hook. God is still just. Justice is preserved, but what I face, what you face, is faced by Jesus in our place. That's God's ultimate answer to the problem of injustice. Jesus. And Jesus facing our justice, the justice we deserve, in our place. And this is the way we move from those who would and perhaps should live in complete fear of the day of judgment. Looking out and praying that it will not happen any day soon, to those who instead are joyfully looking forward to the day of judgment, looking out and praying for it to come one day soon. Because we have been made right with God by Jesus. We have been justified by God in Christ. And we now get to enjoy his perfect righteousness instead of our sin. And how does all of that come about? How is all of that possible? How do you get all of that if you feel that you haven't got that at this point in your life? Well, this is where Habakkuk 2 and verse 4 comes in. It says you get all of that by faith, by trusting in God, by saying to him, please arrange that swap on my behalf. Please may Jesus take what I have done to others in my place. Please may Jesus face your punishment that I deserve in your place. All we need to do is trust in God's just way of saving unjust people like us, which is the cross of Jesus. The cross of Jesus in our place. And if you're someone here today who's never done that, who's never realized that you face God's judgment on the basis of what you have done to others, if you are now petrified at that thought, this is the way out. And it's a beautifully simple way out. All you need to do is put your faith in Jesus. All you need to do is put your faith in God's way of making you right when you're wrong, which is the cross of Christ. And all of that takes is you just saying, please, would you do that for me? All that takes is faith, and then you become righteous. You become right with God too. The cross of Jesus is, if you like, the great example of our God of justice using unjust people to bring about his justice, because it is the great miscarriage of justice, isn't it? In the creation, in the whole history of the world. The person who least deserved punishment faces the worst punishment there. But the reason for that, the reason our God of justice allowed that, the reason our God of justice planned that since before the creation of the world, was that it was the only way to justly save unjust people like you, like me, to free us from his justice. It was the only way in which the things that we have done could be done not to us but to him. So that justice is done and also we can go free. So in amongst all this talk of injustice and punishment and woe and worry and please let me out of this that we get from Habakkuk chapter 2. There is this beautiful little slither of light in verse 4 of a way, as it were, of escaping the justice we deserve. A way of being made right with the God who should be punishing us. And of him doing that, letting us off in a right way. What should our response to that be? Well, praise and thanksgiving, which is exactly where Habakkuk goes next. Chapter 3, a beautiful section of him just praising God for all of this. We're going to do a bit of that ourselves in a moment. But for now, let's just pray. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. Lord, you are in your holy temple. You are perfect. You are a God of justice. You are a God who will one day bring your perfect justice to this world. And we thank you for that as we scan over our planet, as we look into our own hearts, as we look all around, as we see injustice again and again and again. And we thank you that one day soon you are going to bring an end to all injustice. And that everyone will receive the punishment that we deserve, that we will receive what we have done to others ourselves. And we praise you for that justice, but we also want to thank you for, in Jesus, letting us off that justice and allowing him to take our place and allowing him to face that justice for us, allowing him to have done to him what we have done to others. In this passage, we're reminded of what we truly rightly face, but we're also reminded of what you and truly have rightly done for us in the cross of Jesus. And we praise you for that now. And we pray that you would help us to rejoice in your justice and rejoice in your mercy to us in Jesus. We pray this in his precious name. Amen.
So I'm going to invite Ed to come back up and I'm going to ask him some of your questions. Now, feel free to take a pause after I ask each question because I think we have some technical difficulties that mean muting and unmuting. So you've got a little bit of extra thinking time. The first question I've got is one of clarification. How do we know that God is talking about the Babylonians in chapter 2 and not Israel?
Have I been thoughtful enough? How do we know? I think because basically it's just following the dynamic of the first following the dynamic of the conversation so far. So chapter 1, 2-4, Habakkuk's first complaint, the Lord's answer, which is then, the Babylonians are coming and they're going to be like this. And then Habakkuk responding and describing them. And then also God himself, in what he says back, is clear that he's describing them too. So it's the context of the conversation and also the descriptions given by both Habakkuk in verses 15 to 16 and God himself in what he says about the Babylonians in, for instance, verses 4-5. Having said that, there's also the extra dynamic that this seems to be about the Babylonians, but also about other people like the Babylonians through human history, because God gives it that slightly sort of wider focus in chapter 2, verses 2-3.
Thank you. Next question is quite a big one, but why? It's a why question. Why does God take such a circuitous route to bring justice, using more injustice? Why doesn't he bring perfect justice to start with?
So this is just a whole new Ed Shaw, isn't it? Pausing before he answers the question. I'm trying to get used to it myself. God does take, I think it's really helpful that sort of phrase, circuitous route. That's what it feels like from our point of view, doesn't it? Often it would have felt like that in Habakkuk's day. It feels like that when you look at the cross of Jesus. It feels like that on this planet today. And we do want perfect justice to happen, as it were, yesterday. But it's worth us just reflecting on the benefits of the circuitous routes for us are that we're saved and that we don't have to face God's perfect justice himself. So at one level, it's hard to understand how long he takes to do it, and we want to complain. At another level, we just probably want to rejoice in the fact that he is taking his time, because it's that has saved us, and it's that's going to save other people on this planet before God returns in perfect justice. So it's frustrating, but it's also really good news.
Thank you. And we've got a question which uses an example to add on that. Will a murder victim and their family really have justice if the perpetrator becomes a true Christian in prison?
Yeah, and I mean, this is, yes, because the dynamic of God's justice is that the person that will, as it were, take the punishment for that murder is Jesus. So the price will have been paid, and, as it were, has been factored into and is included in all the injustice that Jesus pays for on the cross. So the murderer, as it were, who becomes a Christian and gets off scot-free, actually, justice is done by Jesus in the place of that murderer. And at one level we think, great, and we want to complain about that. That's not just, but then we've got to recommend that we are benefiting from exactly the same scheme ourselves, if I can put it like that. All that I have done has been done to Jesus. And the reason I get off scot-free, the reason you get off scot-free, the reason you don't have to pay for the damage you've caused, the reason I don't have to pay for the damage that I've caused is that Jesus pays the damage for me, the eternal damage for me. So, justice is done. Somebody pays. And in the justice of this universe, it's either the person that's done it, or, incredibly, it's God himself. That is the sort of justice he offers us. Either you pay it yourself, or he'll pay it for you.
Thank you. Lots there for people to unpack in their small group discussions this week. Thank you very much, Ed.